What's good with y'all? Welcome back to the channel, man. We've been doing so good on the subs. We almost hit 2.1K. We're trying to hit 3,000 before the end of the year. But today we got more wrestling reacts for y'all. So this is why WrestleMania 17 was almost the darkest day in WrestleMania in wrestling history.
How?
The best WrestleMania ever. I wonder what happened, but we finna get into it right before the video starts so it trends up in the algorithm. Let's get straight to this video.
WrestleMania 17 is regarded by many as the greatest WrestleMania of all time.
Yeah.
While fans in attendance rejoiced in the absolute spectacle that was WrestleMania 17, they had no idea that they very nearly witnessed perhaps the most shocking tragedy in wrestling history. Outside the arena waited a desperate individual looking to send a message with a loaded gun.
Whoa.
As Paul Heyman called the action at ringside, he had no idea that his life was in danger.
Who wanna go down, Paulie?
To best explain the situation, we need to go all the way back to the very beginnings of Paul Heyman's ECW.
Dang. He must have beef with him for a little minute.
I'm saying. Camped out at WrestleMania
Paul Heyman
is
had
crazy.
been working for WCW as Paul E. Dangerously, but was ultimately fired from the company after butting heads with WCW's booker, Bill Watts. Heyman would soon join Eastern Championship Wrestling, which he would quickly take over as his own and form Extreme Championship Wrestling. His firing from WCW left a chip on Heyman's shoulders.
Dang, he was so small,
While yes,
man.
he presented ECW as anti-WCW and WWF, his real problem was with WCW. This mentality led to ECW becoming the underground rebel of the wrestling industry. Many people credit ECW as being the launching pad for the Attitude Era. Without this company, we may have never seen Stone Cold Steve Austin drinking a beer and flipping off the boss. ECW was edgy, violent, and dangerous. This aura around the company brought an extremely loyal and dedicated fan base.
It's crazy
Heyman
how
was
many
able
people
to
almost actually
create
died in
an us
matches in
versus them
ECW.
mentality that the fans and the
Damn,
entire
man.
locker room would abide by.
Crazy.
One of whom was Tommy Dreamer.
ECW
By the
legend, man.
mid-90s, Dreamer had cemented himself as a core pillar of the ECW brand, his character being described as similar to Die Hard's John McClane. Ordinary man pushed to extraordinary measures. Dreamer was making a name for himself as part of this rebel organization, and the industry began to take notice. In 1995, Dreamer recalls being offered a WCW contract for $75,000 to join the company. He would be brought in to form the tag team The American Males and would be making more money than he was making in ECW. However, Dreamer felt as though ECW had a purpose and was gaining momentum,
They did,
which
bro.
it was. Dreamer also felt like he'd be leaving for enemy territory and betraying Heyman's trust, so Dreamer ultimately declined the offer. Scotty Riggs would form the American Males tag team with Buff Bagwell instead, and Dreamer would go on to become a true ECW legend. He's often referred to as the heart and soul of ECW, and while he wasn't necessarily making huge money at this time, his name value was certainly growing.
It was.
And by 1997, WCW came calling again. This time, WCW offered even more money than before, but were also interested in signing several other ECW stars. Dreamer recalls Raven, the Pitbulls, the Eliminators, RVD, Sabu, Fonzie, and Sandman all receiving calls from WCW.
I think Raven actually
Dreamer assumed, probably correctly, that WCW weren't necessarily interested in him, but rather interested in hurting Heyman and ECW.
Of course.
Dreamer would decline this offer as well and stick with Heyman. During this time, Dreamer would take on more and more responsibility on behalf of the company. He would take on a more managerial role and would even begin booking the matches, all while performing in the ring just as much, if not more, than anybody else.
That's crazy. I didn't know
During
all
this
this.
time, Dreamer was seen as Paul Heyman's right-hand man.
Wow.
Then, leading into the new millennium, Dreamer would receive yet another call from WCW. This time, things were a little more interesting.
Hey, shout out Tommy Dreamer, man.
Eric Bischoff would reportedly offer Dreamer a contract of $750,000 in guaranteed pay. This was obviously a significant bump in pay, and Tommy began to weigh these options. Bischoff wanted to run an ECW invasion angle on their show, but told Tommy that Heyman was not likely to go for it. Bischoff felt they could still do the angle with a guy like Dreamer. Feeling a loyalty to Heyman, Tommy would call Heyman to try to convince him to cooperate with WCW so that each party could benefit. According to Dreamer, Heyman immediately dismissed the idea and stated, "Vince would never forgive me." Tommy immediately picked up on this puzzling statement, but didn't think too much into it at the time. Instead, he would focus on this offer from WCW and what it would mean to him and his family to make that kind of money. Dreamer was faced with a difficult decision to make. He had been a major factor in the success of ECW. In his words, he was all but running the company. He felt that if ECW took off in the way he believed it could, Dreamer would have the most to gain alongside Paul Heyman. Being such a cornerstone of the company both in and outside the ring, if ECW were to succeed, he would too. On the other hand, WCW's offer came with a lot less risk, and Dreamer could make a ton of money without the stress of running the entire company. After much consideration, Dreamer ultimately decided he was headed for WCW.
And at that time, it would look promising. Later on,
Out of
WCW ended up
loyalty to
being
Paul Heyman, Tommy would inform him of his decision face to face. According to Dreamer, Heyman would completely break down. Through the tears, Heyman would tell Tommy that ECW would not survive without him, and that all of his friends wouldn't have jobs if he left. This struck a nerve with Dreamer. Considering himself to be a company guy and loyal friend, these words would ultimately lead him to decline WCW once and for all.
Sheesh.
Somewhat ironically, it would be the WWF who would deliver the final blows to ECW. Despite apparently being on good terms with one another, the WWF would swoop in and sign Taz and the Dudley Boys to the WWF. According to Jim Ross, many people from ECW were actually calling to try to negotiate a deal. Mike Awesome would also leave for WCW as the ECW champion in a bizarre turn of events. And finally, ECW would lose their TV deal with TNN as the WWF landed a deal with the network. ECW struggled financially without a network deal and would ultimately close its doors. Interestingly, it seems as though Heyman and Vince McMahon had been talking for quite some time. According to JR, Vince had been funding ECW with an approximate $50,000 a month to keep the company afloat. Heyman would approach the USA Network to try and secure another TV deal, in which Vince McMahon personally wrote a letter encouraging the network to add ECW to their programming. These efforts would be in vain, however, as ECW would be unable to secure the deal, and the company would soon file for bankruptcy. But it's still interesting to note that McMahon and Heyman were frequently working together during this time. According to JR on the Grilling with JR podcast, the WWF simply wanted to keep the company going, knowing that they would be first in line to buy their assets when the time came. Though Vince McMahon has stated that this was in part due to the WWF signing talent from ECW, feeling it was only fair to give something back since they were using ECW as a developmental territory. In this instance, it was better for them to work together and establish a good relationship while facing their more threatening rival, WCW. Heyman reportedly did not disclose the working relationship with Vince, nor the company's financial struggles, to anybody in the locker room. When Dreamer eventually found out about the financial uncertainty, he decided to put some of his own money into the company. Seeing himself as Heyman's partner, he claims to have put both his and his parents' money into the company so that they could continue the fight against WCW and the WWF, not knowing that Vince McMahon and Heyman were already working together. Despite these efforts, ECW would declare bankruptcy at the end of the year 2000, and the fight for ECW was over.
Wow.
In the span of about a year, Dreamer had gone from declining $750,000 from WCW to now watching both companies close their doors.
Wow.
After the final ECW show on January 13th, 2001, the company was forced into bankruptcy proceedings.
Dang.
During this time, Paul Heyman would be brought on as a color commentator in the WWF, filling in for Jerry Lawler, who had left the company in protest for the firing of his then-wife, Stacey Carter.
Wow.
Heyman would reportedly promise to bring Dreamer in with him on multiple occasions, but after all of these plans fell through, Dreamer began to get desperate. In the weeks leading up to WrestleMania 17, Heyman would again call Dreamer to tell him he would have a spot on the show in the now legendary TLC match. However, these plans would again fall through for unknown reasons, and Dreamer's spot would be taken by Rhino. Then later, Heyman would tell Dreamer once again that he would debut in a hardcore match at WrestleMania, with, quote, the focus being entirely on you. But these plans, too, would be cancelled. Dreamer was now feeling a lot of resentment towards Heyman. The man who Dreamer had considered a close friend and business partner had lied to him.
Are we setting up for y'all to tell us that Tommy Dreamer was trying to smoke Paul Heyman?
Ain't no way.
Are y'all trying to tell me that Tommy Dreamer tried to smoke Paul Heyman?
Ain't no way.
About ECW's financial position, had accepted his and his family's money without telling him that McMahon was already pouring money into it, had begged Dreamer not to take the biggest contract of his life, and was seemingly now lying to Dreamer once again with the promise of a WWF run that simply wasn't coming to fruition. Feeling betrayed, Tommy would fall into a deep depression.
Dang.
According to Dreamer himself, his thoughts would get darker by the day, and soon convinced himself that Paul Heyman had to pay. Tommy was working on the Indies during this time and found himself in Texas just a few days out from WrestleMania 17, which was also set to take place in Texas. While at the indie show, Tommy would see a sign permitting firearms into the building, with a staff member explaining that in Texas, you can carry a weapon on you when entering a venue. This would spark a sinister plan in Tommy's head. According to Dreamer himself, he had decided he was going to get revenge on Heyman in the most brutal and public way possible at the Showcase of Immortals. While the event was taking place, his plan was to simply walk into the Houston Astrodome with a loaded gun, and at some point during the broadcast, he would appear behind the announcer's desk live on TV, jump the barricade, and shoot Heyman in front of a live audience. He would then hit his signature pose before turning the gun on himself and ending it all. This may seem like some twisted daydream with zero intention behind it. However, according to Dreamer, he was absolutely set on this plan. In his mind, Heyman had ruined his and his family's lives and thought he would be, quote, the ultimate martyr for these actions. He apparently got so far into this plan as to actually show up outside the Astrodome with a loaded gun. While the event was taking place, Dreamer was apparently across the street, sitting in his car with a loaded weapon. There's some speculation from a few different sources that he had secured a front row ticket from a scalper and was ready to execute his plan. Fortunately, earlier that day, Dreamer had received a phone call. It was an unrecognized number, so he hadn't answered the phone, but the caller did leave a voicemail. At some point during the evening, Dreamer decided to check this voicemail. The message was from none other than good old JR. Hey Tommy, it's Jim Ross. Just wanted to let you know we are still thinking about you. We are gonna get it done.
Ooh.
Just gotta hang tight.
Shout out Jim Ross, man.
This single phone call gave Dreamer a glimmer of hope. Until now, Dreamer had only heard from Heyman about any WWF plans.
Whoa.
But now JR himself, who was head of talent relations, was telling him that they had plans for him and that they were in fact thinking of him. While it may never be a $750,000 contract, it was still an opportunity. This phone call let Dreamer know that he wasn't forgotten by the world of wrestling, and there was still hope for his career.
Wow.
Dreamer would thankfully drive away, and what would have probably been the darkest broadcast in television history never came to be. WrestleMania 17 would go on to become a legendary event, and Dreamer would eventually be brought into the WWF on July 9th, 2001 as part of the Invasion storyline. Ironically, once again, standing side by side with Paul Heyman.
So, when did Paul Heyman ever find out about this?
That's what I'm saying. Like, what was the aftermath? Like, what was the relationship after? Because I'm assuming he didn't tell him immediately. Because you gonna kill somebody, you ain't gonna tell him like, hey, yo, I was about to kill you a few weeks ago. It's crazy, like what these superstars, these athletes be going through, and we be having no idea. But hey, man, that was why WrestleMania 17 was almost the darkest day in WWE history. If y'all want more documentary videos like this or whatever, considering wrestling, let us know. I try something different because we usually just get straight to the action. But if y'all like this, we'll see how this one does, and I'll keep doing it. If not, hey, but like and subscribe if y'all new. Leave a comment too. We gonna see y'all in this.
Poppin' tags, YSL.
Imagine just chilling at your broadcast table and you just get boomed in front of like 100,000.
You know, it's crazy to even think about that could have possibly happened. My thought is, how would WWE would have recovered from that?
They might not have ever recovered, bro.